Okay, well, welcome. Um, my name is Anna Meadows. I am an outreach coordinator with the Springfield Community Gardens. We're a nonprofit based in Springfield, Missouri, whose vision is a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. This workshop on infrastructure planning for market gardening is generously sponsored by the USDA NIFA CFP grant program. So to break that down a little bit, that's the United States Department of Agriculture's National Institute of Food and Agriculture's Community Food Project. And our speaker tonight is Patrick Byers. He's a horticulture field specialist with the University of Missouri Extension, and I'll let him introduce himself further in just a moment. But before we get started, just some housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout the night, please ask as we go. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can type in your questions throughout the presentation as they come up, and we will stop periodically to chat with Patrick about them. I'll be monitoring that Q&A section, so I will keep an eye out for any questions that you have throughout the night. There's also a chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Please only use this for comments, which helps me keep track of questions versus comments throughout the night. Also, once you leave this workshop, a screen will pop up with a link to a post-workshop survey. This survey is used in SCG's reporting to the USDA and also helps us provide meaningful workshops to all of you in the future. So we would appreciate it if you could take a few moments at the end of this workshop to fill that out. And if you'd like to refer to this workshop later on, it will be available on SCG's Agriculture Workshop playlist on our YouTube channel by the end of this week. And I'll put a link to that as well as our website, social media, and tonight's exit survey in the chat in just a moment. So that's it from me. Patrick, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Anna. I appreciate the welcoming and the introduction. As Anna mentioned, my name is Patrick Byers, and I'm a field specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and my focus is on horticulture. And if you had to sum up my job in one sentence, it would be to help farmers to be profitable in the short term and sustainable in the long term. And I'm really excited about this partnership that MU Extension has with Springfield Community Gardens, which of course includes our workshop this evening. And boy, when I think about the decisions that farmers have to make, particularly new farmers just starting out, infrastructure is so important, and some of these decisions are difficult to unmake if you don't do a good job off the bat. So very important to think carefully about farm infrastructure because it is going to be key to your success as a farmer. And we'll spend the next 90 minutes or so talking about just that. And I'm excited to have with me tonight videos from several area farmers, successful farmers, sharing their perspectives on infrastructure. So we'll sprinkle those throughout the workshop this evening. As Anna mentioned, please feel free to enter any questions you might have in the Q&A, and I'll stop periodically and we can field questions in person as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, Anna, can we see the presentation?
You can see it.
Okay, very good. All right. So the topic of our workshop this evening is specialty crop farms, land and infrastructure. And I'll be devoting more time to infrastructure, but obviously land and infrastructure are hand in hand from the standpoint of success for farming. And I'll have some comments about land as well. A little bit about my background. I've been a field specialist with University of Missouri Extension for a little bit over 13 years now. Prior to that, I worked for 18 years with Missouri State University's State Fruit Experiment Station as an outreach trainer for farmers. And again, my career has been in service to farmers. I'm also a farmer myself, and you can see me in one of my former jobs as a peach grower. I used to have a peach orchard on my farm east of Springfield. I've transitioned into other crops, and in fact, we'll use my farm as a bit of a case study for tonight's workshop. As Anna mentioned, this workshop will be recorded. I will say at this point, particularly if you're located in Southwest Missouri and you'd like to visit with me about your plans, I'd love to do that, bounce ideas off me. Oftentimes having several sets of perspectives on something as important as infrastructure is very helpful. So please feel free to reach out. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation. This workshop is a partnership, and one of the partners is Springfield Community Gardens, where the vision of Springfield Community Gardens is a community where everyone has access to healthy local foods. And Springfield Community Gardens manages a network of community gardens across Greene County. And the organization has developed a very innovative Farmer Incubator Program. So if you're a new farmer and you'd like to learn more about how to succeed in this undertaking, reach out to Springfield Community Gardens to take advantage of their programs. And as Anna mentioned, our other partner is the USDA, which has very generously funded a number of projects with Springfield Community Gardens, including our workshop series this evening. The services from USDA are available to farmers of all scale, including small scale farmers. A good place to start in your quest for understanding USDA programs is the farmers.gov resources website, or reach out to your local farm services agency. FSA. FSA has offices in most counties in Missouri, and generally in the FSA office, you can find the Natural Resources Conservation Service and the Risk Management Agency, both groups that are very supportive of small-scale specialty crop production. Well, this is what I'd like to cover tonight. We'll talk a little bit about planning, and we actually have a workshop on farm planning and business planning that was presented earlier in the year, and that recording is available, as Anna mentioned, on the Springfield Community Gardens YouTube channel. So check that out. But we'll touch on a few aspects of planning and how that relates to farm infrastructure. Then we'll talk about land and production areas. Then we'll get into the actual changes that we as farmers might do to a piece of land, piece of property to make it suitable for what we'd like to do. We'll talk about water supply and distribution, pack houses, cold storage. We'll talk about production structures. We'll talk about the possibility of structures for value-added products and processing. Then we'll talk a bit about storage, and then we'll finish out our time tonight talking about sales areas. Well, to introduce tonight, as I work with farmers, I've learned so much for the wisdom of farmers, particularly farmers who have been doing this for some time. And there is a gentleman named Greg Reynolds of Riverbend Farms up in Minnesota, and I've read some of his writings, and he's also contributed to a number of books that I've read. And he has this statement that I think is really a good one to consider, where he says, business planning is a critical component to any operation. Even though a seat of the pants approach to farming might work, it takes too long to figure out if a decision is a poor one. You can waste years doing the wrong thing when you could have been doing the right thing. And he is so right. He is so right. If you'd like to learn more about Greg Reynolds and his farm, check out the website there listed. So when it comes to planning, again, whole farm planning is really important. An important aspect of that is the business plan. And the business plan has 5 basic steps. First of all, to identify values. Secondly, to review your history and the history of your farm and take stock of your current situation. Third, clarify your vision, develop a mission statement, and identify goals. Fourth, and this is our focus area for tonight's workshop, strategic planning and evaluation. And then finally, present, implement, and monitor the business plan. This publication, Building a Sustainable Business, has an excellent section on the material that we're going to cover tonight, strategic planning and evaluation. So check it out. It's available online as a free downloadable PDF. You can also order the hard copy if you'd like. And then, as I mentioned, we have a video on business planning using the Building a Sustainable Business model as our guide point for that workshop, available at this particular website. This is the Springfield Community Gardens YouTube channel. Now, strategic planning and evaluation, 4 basic things to think about: marketing strategy, operations strategy, human resources strategy, and financial strategy. Now, we're not going to delve into human resources strategy. For more information on that, please take a look at the recording of our earlier business planning workshop. We're going to be focusing on infrastructure and land, and we're going to flavor that or color that looking at marketing strategy, operations strategy, and financial strategy. So to introduce these topics, let's take a quick look at these 3 areas. So marketing strategy, your marketing strategy, where you plan to market what you grow on your farm, is going to be an important aspect of planning infrastructure. And certainly the marketing strategy will help inform where you locate your farm relative to markets and whether or not the infrastructure you need is on your farm or perhaps infrastructure that you might need off farm. So again, thinking about your marketing strategy will help inform your thoughts relative to farm infrastructure. Operations strategy. Basically, operations strategy is focused on actually producing the crops you're interested in growing. And This is probably the most obvious aspect of business planning and how as it relates to infrastructure. But your operation strategy obviously is going to guide the way that you lay out your farm, where you're going to position production areas relative to operations areas, and it's certainly going to help guide your need for infrastructure. And then finally, your financial strategy. Certainly real estate is a large farm expense, especially for new farmers who are starting out with the goal of purchasing real estate. And having a financial strategy relative to real estate is critically important because this decision, quite frankly, can make or break the farm. So very important to understand that. And as far as what we're going to consider under financial strategy, certainly the price of the land, the value of the land and the infrastructure to you, financial feasibility, and of course, the risk to cash flow, especially in the early years of the farm. Okay, so that's our introductory material. And do we have any questions at this point, Anna?
We do not.
Okay, as I mentioned before, please enter any questions you might have in the Q&A, and we'll stop periodically during the presentation and tackle those. So let's turn our attention to land and production areas. And as we look at this picture, this is an interesting picture. It shows land in production. It shows very carefully considered layout of fields. It shows ways the fields are managed, but it also shows adjacent land. It shows a house. And if you could look a little bit further to the right, you would see some of the other buildings, some of the other solid assets of this particular farm. So again, land and production area is a very important aspect of developing a profitable and sustainable specialty crop farm. So what do we need to grow crops? Well, we could distill all that down into we need arable soil, we need sunlight, we need water, and we need room for plants to grow. In other words, we need spacing and placement of plants such that we have good air movement and such around those plants. So that's pretty straightforward, but it becomes a bit complicated, especially when we look at farms in areas such as Southwest Missouri, where even on a small scale farm, we can have lots and lots of different aspects to the land. So it's still good to keep these basic considerations in mind. But as we look at the different parts of a farm, even a small farm, there are going to be areas that are more suited for what we want to do compared to other areas. And we want to carefully consider these things early on, before we make commitments that can't be undone easily. This is a great time to invite a specialist to come in and walk over the farm with you and give you some advice based on their experience. And again, please reach out to University of Missouri Extension. This is one of the services that we offer. In fact, it's one of the most valuable services that we offer. Now, what do you want to avoid as a farmer? Poorly drained soils. They're difficult to work with. They're difficult to correct. If possible, avoid them. If you're locked into using poorly drained soils, recognize there will be a cost in time and effort and money to make those soils suitable for specialty crops. Sites prone to flooding, avoid these sites as well. Again, there's not a lot that can be done if you're looking at a bottomland field that floods with some regularity. Perhaps you could build dikes or berms or other diversions, but that too is expensive. So whenever possible, avoid sites that are prone to flooding. And why is this important? Well, if for no other reason, a crop that's been exposed to floodwater is considered unsalable from the standpoint of Food and Drug Administration regulations. So again, that's a compelling reason to avoid bottomland sites. And then think about any issues that might make a site difficult to prepare and maintain for production. What might be an example here? Well, perhaps a site in timber, perhaps a site that is very rocky, perhaps a site with very shallow soil, perhaps a site with a very heavy soil. These are all things to consider. And it's very important to assess these characteristics early on when planning a specialty crop farm. So again, some more thoughts on assessing suitability. Again, talk to someone who has local knowledge. I have been in a number of situations with farmers who have bought land sight unseen, sometimes from a long distance away, without doing some of this suitability assessment. And when they arrive, when they begin to plan their farm, there can be challenges in place that could have been avoided early on, perhaps even a purchase that could have been avoided because the site was not suitable. So again, very important to talk to someone who understands local conditions. Now, once a site is under serious consideration, there are some ways that we can assess the suitability of the soil. Soil testing is an excellent way to get a picture of the chemistry of the soil. We can also examine the soil profile by digging pits and looking at the three-dimensional arrangement of the soil. This is going to give us clues relative to water drainage and other aspects of the soil. And we can also do soil health evaluations, understanding how healthy the soil is relative to things such as microbial activity and three-dimensional structure. And again, it's definitely worth putting the time and effort into assessing suitability, because this can help guide, first of all, the decision as to whether or not this is even going to be suitable for what we'd like to do. And then secondly, if a particular area on the farm might be more suitable than another area on the farm relative to what we'd like to grow. Some other considerations, are we going to own or lease the land? And there can be advantages to both approaches. And I've worked with successful farmers who really own very little of the land that they farm on, but they have leases in place, perhaps long-term arrangements with the owners. And this can be a viable way to obtain land and to produce crops. If we are purchasing the land, what about the cost? If we expect the income from the farm to offset the cost of the land, this can be a very important consideration, particularly if we're purchasing high-value land in urban areas. What about the previous and current uses of the site? Sometimes there are situations where a previous use of the site might make that site unsuitable for specialty crop production. I've worked with a number of urban farmers who have assessed suitability of urban sites and found, unfortunately to their dismay, that there might be hazardous levels of heavy metals, for example, at some sites because of previous uses of that land. What about current uses? Well, again, if we're thinking about locating a specialty crop farm in a timbered area, there may be an expense related to removing the trees so that the site can be opened up and made suitable for specialty crop production. There may be restrictions on uses, perhaps governmental restrictions related to planning and zoning. Perhaps there might be issues related to what's going on around the proposed site. For example, if we're interested in growing produce and we're surrounded by row crop areas where we know there's going to be heavy herbicide use, this could be a definite consideration that may or may not make that site suitable for production of specialty crops. If we're considering growing specialty crops in close proximity to livestock, recognize there may be some produce food safety concerns related to that situation. And then the location of this farm or this production area relative to markets. If we're going to market at the farm, well, we need to be thinking about base population and the numbers of people coming by the farm. If we're marketing distant from the farm, how far away is that market? It can be a challenge, for example, to market at a farmer's market that's more than 30 miles away. So think about the relative location of the farm relative to the markets that you intend to serve with the production from that farm. These are all considerations to think about. And again, these are general statements, very important to sit down and figure this out for your farm. And as I mentioned before, reach out and work with local resources, work with local farmers, work with local extension specialists, others who have a perspective on the suitability of land for intended uses and for intended markets. Okay, I promised that I would use my farm as an example, and here's my farm. I'm located just off of Highway 60 east of Fordland. And I will say that I've actually sold this farm, but up until about 6 months ago, this was my farm. And the process that I'm showing here is actually a process that I went through a number of years as I was developing this farm. And so this farm has frontage on Highway Z on the east side, railroad tracks on the north side, and just on the other side of the railroad tracks, a very busy highway, Highway 60. Lots and lots of cars going by. As you can see, there are some arable sites. There's a sizable field there adjacent to the railroad tracks. There's an area of woods, and then over by as you move west of that area between Highway Z and the woods is where my home was located, and also some additional open areas and an existing barn. So there were two structures originally present on that farm when I moved in. And so again, it was a very interesting and fun exercise to go through in determining how I would set that farm up for production. I mentioned that I grew peaches initially, and then I transitioned into berries. The area there on the east side, the large square area, divided down the middle, that's an area that I'm considering, or I was considering, for blackberries and elderberries. And then the other area to the west of that is open ground. It's in native prairie, and that would be my area of expansion. So again, when you're thinking about infrastructure planning, you not only want to think about today, but you also want to think about the future. You should have in place a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, or perhaps even longer into the future when we think about growing specialty crops, especially perennial specialty crops. In addition to the berries, I knew that I was interested in some commercial scale garlic production. And also I'm interested in native tree fruits. And I thought I would try my hand at persimmons. So I designated 2 areas, one area for garlic production and one area for persimmon production, close to the existing home and the existing barn. So again, you can see outlined in green my planned production areas at this particular farm. Okay, do we have any questions relative to land, Anna?
We do not right now.
Okay, again, as I mentioned, whenever we break, if you would like to unmute and ask questions, please feel free to do that. Okay, let's turn our attention now to water supply and distribution. And water is absolutely necessary for specialty crop production in Missouri, especially in Southwest Missouri, where we know there are going to be dry periods every growing season. In some seasons, we experience droughts. And for a farmer to be consistently profitable in a given year and sustainable in the long term, there must be an adequate supply of water. Now, how do we use water on the farm? Well, oftentimes the first use that comes to mind is irrigation to support the growth of specialty crops. But we also use water during harvest and post-harvest of these crops. We use water to clean crops. We use water to clean surfaces. We use water to wash our hands. We also use water for other uses relative to growing the crops. We use it to apply sprays. We use it to cool crops. There are various ways that we use water during crop production. If we have livestock, obviously water is critically important to meet the water needs of livestock. We also have general farm uses of water and personal uses of water. Now, the bottom line, though, is make sure you have enough water. There's nothing more frustrating than to have an insufficient supply of water and have to either purchase expensive water or have water brought in, which is extremely inefficient and inconvenient. So again, make sure that you have adequate water available for your use on the farm. Now, what about surface water sources? Many of us are blessed with streams or ponds on our properties, and this can be a source of water, but several reality checks. First of all, surface water sources are more vulnerable to contamination. Look at those cows down there cooling off. While they're cooling off, they're also pooping. And the reality is that surface water is uniformly contaminated to some degree. It's definitely, I can't point to any surface water sources that would be considered a drinking water quality. So that has to be recognized. Surface water sources are difficult to monitor and control. And, I mentioned the issue of flooding. Well, that can be a problem with a surface water source. And then the other issue, of course, is surface sources are oftentimes less reliable. And this is particularly the case during extended droughts. If we're relying upon a stream or a pond for watering, those sources become limited during dry periods, which is, of course, the opposite of the situation we would like to see. Looking back to 2012, which was the last year of extreme drought in Missouri, many streams that had not dried up previously for decades dried up in 2012. Many ponds, the levels dropped to a point where the water was no longer usable. So recognize that surface sources can be most limited during the times when we most need them. But even so, a surface water source can be an asset. What about wells? Wells are an excellent water source on the farm. Oftentimes, the groundwater is good enough quality that it can be used to supply drinking water quality water. And this is very important as we use water for such purposes as rinsing produce or cleaning surfaces or washing our hands. Keep in mind, though, that there can be issues with groundwater. Water quality in a well situation depends upon well construction and hydrology. And there can be some issues. If we look at that lower picture there, we'll notice the wellhead. Good situation is an elevated wellhead where the land slopes away. A fair would be, yes, the wellhead is elevated above the surrounding soil, but it's fairly flat. But a poor situation, as we see in the third picture, is a situation where water collects at the wellhead, moves down the casing, and can cause contamination issues in the well. Now, what about understanding the quality of water, both surface water and well water? Well, the answer here is water testing. And it's very important to routinely test water sources, be it wells or surface water sources, and to keep the records of those tests. And if we look at some of the governmental regulations, the produce safety rule, which was issued by the Food and Drug Administration, if your farm is subject to the produce safety rule, you're required to test your water, again, to understand the quality of that water and the risk that it might carry relative to produce safety and microbial contamination. Now, what about municipal water? What about that water that is brought to your farm by a city, a county, a water authority, or some other agency? Well, that water in most cases is less prone to problems. That water is tested frequently, and in many cases it's treated. It is expensive though, that's the trade-off. Now, many farms actually have access to municipal water, but also have access to an on-farm water source, such as a well. And backup is always a good thing when it comes to water on the farm. So again, when we're thinking about water infrastructure, whenever possible, if we can have more than one source, this is an advantage on the farm. Why is this a benefit? Well, if we rely upon well water, for example, and we discover that there's an issue with well water, we can then switch over to using municipal water. And having that backup can make all the difference. So again, good situation when looking at a farm and thinking about water to have more than one water source. Now, the source is important, but so is distribution. And when we think about distributing water on the farm, you want to certainly think about efficiency and maintenance, because distribution systems have to be maintained. Otherwise, problems occur, leaks, drops in pressure, or even outright breaks and contamination of water. As I mentioned before, think about contingency, have a backup in place, and think about future plans. If your goal is to expand production into other areas and you're developing your initial water distribution system, set it up in such a way that it's easy and efficient to extend that system to these new areas where you're going to start production somewhere down the road. And again, reach out for advice on how to do this. Sometimes it's a little hard to look into the future with unclouded eyes. But if you bring more than one set of eyes to bear on the situation, you can oftentimes get some good advice. And then think about produce food safety as well. And what we're talking about here is primarily clean water and delivering it to where it's going to be used in clean conditions. So either a well or a municipal source as it arrives on the farm. We want to have a system that can deliver that water in a potable state. And this includes things such as sanitary hydrants and components that are used to construct the water distribution system that are of potable water quality. So again, very important to get some good advice on how to do this before developing these distribution systems. Okay, I just show this picture to demonstrate that sometimes developing infrastructure for water distribution can be a little bit complicated. And if we look at this picture, we can see the flow from the water supply over on the far left, but a lot of things are in place at the point where that water then heads out to the production field. So things such as a backflow preventer to keep contamination from moving back into a water source is very important. Pressure gauges so that you understand pressure within the system, perhaps infrastructure that would be related to chemical injection, fertilizers that could be injected into the irrigation water, perhaps a pressure regulator to help keep the water pressure from becoming too high, at damaging levels as the water moves out into the distribution system. And then an air relief valve. When it comes time to clean out the system, an air relief valve can be very helpful. And then, of course, a filter, as we see there in the middle, to remove problems from the water, suspended solids, algae, other problems. All of these are important parts of the water distribution infrastructure on the farm. And again, as I said before, please reach out for advice on this. As you develop a water distribution system, the services of an irrigation specialist can be extremely, extremely helpful and valuable. One other aspect of water distribution and supply is water storage. And certainly if we have a reliable well, then our storage is the underground water. But particularly if we're using surface water, we want to think carefully about an adequate supply. As I mentioned before, surface water sources oftentimes are most limiting during the times when we need them the most. So some things we want to consider: we can actually store water in the distribution system with storage tanks. We can also develop a soil root zone that has adequate levels of organic matter so that we can actually store some degree of water in the soil itself. But having water catchment or ponds can be very helpful from the standpoint of maintaining an adequate supply of water. And at this point, I thought we would take a quick look at a video from Iowa State University on water catchment from a high tunnel. This is a benefit of having a high tunnel. We'll talk more about that here in a moment. But water catchment is certainly viable off of surfaces such as a high tunnel. So let's take a quick look at this video.
So why put rain gutters on a high tunnel? Well, we find that when the rainwater rolls off the roof of a high tunnel, you frequently get wetness problems along the edge of the tunnel that seep back into the tunnel. There are erosion problems, all kinds of problems with that extra water. Besides that, you can harvest that rainwater and use it back in the tunnel. And in studies, we've found that you can get a significant portion, maybe more than half of the water needs for the crop in the tunnel served by that rainwater. So we did a rainwater collection system on a high tunnel. We had at one of our research farms. I'd like to show you how we installed that system. The system is comprised of 3 parts. Basically, we have the gutters to collect the water off the roof. We have storage tanks to hold that water until we can use it, and then a pumping system to reuse the rainwater inside the tunnel. Mounting the gutters onto a Quonset-shaped high tunnel means we're mounting on curved sides. In order to get the gutters closer to level, we needed angled mounting boards. We ripped 2x4 planks lengthwise at an angle so that we could have a beveled mounting board to mount to the side of this curved arch frame on our Quonset-type high tunnel. The beveled mounting boards were attached to the high tunnel frames underneath the tarp on the inside of the high tunnel. We used simple conduit or plumbing type straps to attach the angled mounting boards to the tunnel frames, using short construction screws to attach the clamps to the board. A string line stretched from one end of the high tunnel to the other gave us a line to follow in mounting the boards on the tunnel frames. The string line had to be pulled out a little bit so it would clear all the frames as it went from one end of the tunnel to the other. And we set the string line at the slope that we wanted the gutters to follow in the end, about 6 inches of drop from one end of the tunnel to the other. This guide allowed us to align the mounting boards. Vinyl gutter brackets were then attached to the mounting board from outside, screwing right through the tarp of the high tunnel into the mounting board. The gutter sections are connected with gasketed slip joints. These joints must be located in the proper spot for the sections to come together. Measure that distance and locate the slip joints, allowing for the expansion and contraction of the vinyl gutters. Follow the manufacturer's recommendations for the gap that you allow. A string line on the outside of the tunnel helped us to align the bottom of the mounting brackets and the splice brackets as we mounted the brackets to the wooden mounting board. Once in place, following the string line, the gutter brackets formed a nice uniform slope from one end of the high tunnel to the other. We recommend 6 to 8 inches of slope in 100 feet of gutter on a high tunnel. Vinyl gutter sections are inserted into the gutter brackets, and the brackets are clipped over the top of the gutter to hold it in place. This type of system makes it easy to remove the gutter sections. For example, in the wintertime in our climate, we'd like to pull the gutter sections off so that ice and snow sliding off the roof of the tunnel don't tear up our gutter. Here's the finished gutter in place with 6 to 8 inches of slope from one end of the high tunnel to the other. You can see it's not a straight line looking down the edge of the tunnel because the frames aren't that perfectly uniform, but we do have a nice uniform slope from one end to the other. An end cap is placed on the high end of the gutter. This cap has a gasket built into the cap. It's simply snapped over the end of the gutter and ready to go. On our high tunnel, there were straps over the top to help control wind billowing of the roof of the high tunnel. We made sure to install the gutter sections underneath those roof straps so that they didn't interfere with the installation of the gutters. When installing the gutter sections, make sure to leave the recommended gap between the gutter sections as you install them into the slip joints. To get rainwater off of the roof and into the gutter, we needed a flap attached to the tunnel roof. This flap is just a piece of roofing material that we attached to the tunnel to get the water off of the tunnel roof and inside the gutters. The rain flap can be attached under the wiggle wire on the hip board, or we found it easier to simply tape a short flap to the tunnel roof using roof repair tape. When taping the rain flap to the tunnel roof, you may have to work around the brace ropes that hold the roll-up sides on the tunnel in place. Cutting the tape around these ropes may help to avoid leaks that you would get from water running behind the ropes and the tape. Wind may blow the rain flap around on the side of the high tunnel. It may be necessary to weight the bottom edge of the flap to hold it in place. Many types of weights may work on the bottom edge of the rain flap. In this case, we found that a number 9 wire threaded through holes punched in the bottom edge of the flap held it down inside the gutter. We also tried fishing weights, and any other type of weight that you can attach to the bottom edge of the flap might work. The second part of the system includes tanks for storing the rainwater. Because our system has 2 water tanks, we had to make sure that the water tanks were at the same level so we could connect the 2 tanks together and not have one tank flowing over into the other tank and overflowing the top of one of the 2 tanks. So the first thing we had to do in setting those tanks was to make sure the pads were at approximately the same level for the 2 tanks. Providing a smooth surface for the tanks to sit on was important for support. You could use fill sand, you could use fine crushed rock. In our case, we used limestone screenings, which are even finer than road rock. They were easy to pour out on the pad and smooth off with a plank just to get a nice level surface. Once our pads were in place, we put the tanks on the pads, making sure that we aligned the tank with the line that the gutter would form as it came off the end of the high tunnel. It's important to use clean water tanks for rainwater capture because this water is going to be used on the crops inside. We did not want to have old tanks that had been used for pesticide storage or transport. The gutter directs rainwater from the high tunnel to the storage tank at the end of the building. A drop from the gutter fills the tank. To avoid overfilling the tank, a ball valve made from a toy inflatable ball rises to seal off the gutter drop. As the ball floats up, it seals against a sewer adapter on the end of the gutter drop. Extra rainwater bypasses the full tank to an overflow downspout and away from the high tunnel. A wire basket holds the ball in place inside the tank and keeps it positioned just below the gutter drop. A flexible water line brings rainwater from the tank into the high tunnel. Our 2 tanks are connected to the pump using a Y valve so we can draw from either or both tanks. A 200 mesh filter protects the pumps and the drip irrigation system. Because collected rainwater contains bacteria, use it only for drip irrigation and never on the surface of produce or for any other use.
Okay, so you get the picture. That is definitely an asset. Collecting the rainwater off of a tunnel, that rainwater becomes an asset and is very useful for storage for use later on. Okay, do we have any questions about water at this point?
We do not.
Okay, very good. Well, let's return to the presentation. Okay, some other final comments on water. We do have to think about water and personal use on the farm as well, because there are going to be many times we'll be washing our hands, washing equipment, water for sanitary use in bathrooms. and also water for waste management. So again, very important to think about where that water is going to come from as well. And in all cases for these personal uses, the water must be potable, must be drinking water quality. Well, here's how I set it up on my farm. I had a well drilled, and again, I was going to use the same well, at least initially, for crop production and for personal use. So the well was located close to the house, and then I developed a distribution system where I ran 2 lines out from the well, one towards the berry production area, and I put in 2 control points, one as I entered the field and one at the other end of the field. And the reason for that second control point was, again, for my plans for expansion into the open field area. And then the second line went down towards the barn. Now, I was interested in having rabbits on my farm as well, and the barn was going to be headquarters for rabbits. And so I needed a water control point at the barn. But I also needed a control point between the garlic production area and the persimmon area so that I could develop irrigation systems that went into both of those plantings. I will say, based on my experience, that sharing a well between household use and crop production can be challenging. And at some point, it's going to be a good plan to develop dedicated water sources for both household use and a dedicated water source for crop production. Again, it just makes more sense. It's also easier to separate out the costs of that water when it comes time to reporting production costs on your taxes. So dedicated wells can be very helpful. Okay, any questions before we move on to pack houses?
No questions right now.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to actual facilities that we're going to construct on the farm. And we're going to start with a pack house and crop storage building. And does every farm need an enclosed building for a pack house? No, of course not. But in many cases, this is a useful goal to have in your plan, an enclosed pack house where you can handle produce and store that produce for varying lengths of time. So what do you need in a pack house? Well, basically, you need an area to unload harvested crop as it comes in from the production field. You need an area where you can wash crop if necessary, an area for grading and packing, an area for storage to hold crop. Perhaps this is a cold storage area, a cooler or a refrigerator, or perhaps it's just an area where you keep things cooler than ambient temperatures, as you would, for example, with tomatoes. And then if you're going to move that crop away from the farm, transporting it to market, you need an area for loading. Now, again, not all pack houses will have all of these areas. The aspects of a pack house are very much determined by the characteristics of the crop and the marketing strategy for a farm. But in general, a pack house is an excellent investment from the standpoint of efficient, profitable management, especially crop farm. Now, when we think about how crops flow into and out of pack houses, we want to always be conscious of how we set the pack house up relative to this flow. And for example, one flow is from dirty to clean, where we have crops coming in from the field in a dirty condition, and then they're leaving the pack house in a condition where they're ready for sales, where they're clean. We also have a situation where a crop comes in from the field at field heat, and as it enters the pack house, we manage it, handle it in such a way that it cools off so that we can prolong the life of that produce. And then the third thing, crop comes in from the field, typically in some sort of bulk container, a basket, a bin, whatever it might be. And then it leaves the pack house, in many cases, in a sales container, which is frequently smaller, frequently specialized. So again, these are 3 flows to think about: dirty to clean, field heat to storage, and field to market ready. And if we look at this diagram of the pack house, this is the pack house that I set up on my farm. And crop came in on the west side. This was a lean-to structure where I unloaded crop. I also had an enclosed area on that lean-to for storing my packaging. And then an overhead door, and then a pass-through door. The overhead door I would open up and bring crop in through that. It would enter into the enclosed part of my pack house. Within that pack house, I had bathroom facilities and a hand washing sink. Looking at this diagram, it probably would have been made more sense to move the hand washing sink to the other side of the bathroom. But at any rate, you need sanitary facilities available somewhere on the farm. And the pack house is a very convenient place to locate those facilities. Why is the hand washing sink outside of the bathroom? Well, with a hand washing sink outside of the bathroom, you can watch and make sure the people who've used the bathroom are actually washing their hands. And then crop moves into that central area where it's graded and handled. I set up plastic tables to handle crop on there. They're easy to put up and break down. And the surfaces of plastic tables are easy to clean and sanitize. And that's an overriding concern throughout the pack house. In the pack house, surfaces, whenever possible, should be surfaces that can be easily cleaned and sanitized. So some surfaces to consider would be plastic surfaces, stainless steel surfaces, other impervious surfaces that are durable. Surfaces to avoid would be wooden surfaces, ceramic tiles with grout lines, surfaces that are damaged that provide harborage for bacteria and other microorganisms. So think carefully about the surfaces in the pack house. I had cold storage. It was in this part of the pack house as well. And then I had a sales area there on the farm. There was a lean-to on the east side of the pack house. And so produce would then move from cold storage or directly from grading and handling into the sales area. So again, an example of a consideration of flow of product in the pack house: dirty to clean, field heat to storage, and field to market ready. Now, let's listen to an experienced farmer for his perspective on pack houses and crop storage. And this is an interview with Kevin Prather, who is a lead farmer with Springfield Community Gardens.
Hi everybody, my name is Kevin Prather. I'm the lead farmer with Springfield Community Gardens. I oversee 3, soon to be 4 farm incubator sites where our goal is to provide our neighborhoods with awesome organically raised veggies, but also do some training as well. Well, we've been growing here at the market garden here at Fairbanks for about 5 years. And as you can see, the pack shed isn't quite finished up yet. So still at this point, we're doing all of our processing outside. It is doable, but this was a much better option for a variety of reasons. Number one, we can't really, of course, control the elements when we're outside as easily as we can when we're in a building. So for farmers' comfort, it's definitely nice to be enclosed with 4 walls. Secondarily, food safety concerns. You know, there's birds outside and things falling from the sky, you know, and inside we can control sort of what comes into contact with food better than we could outside. And we can also keep our equipment much cleaner inside than we could outside as well, which has food safety implications. Another reason why a pack shed was really important to us was for storage. Over the last few years going to market, we would have to harvest pretty much just before going to market, maybe the night before, and try to jam pack things into refrigerators in our homes or what have you. And now, of course, we have a large insulated walk-in cooler. We can not only store our produce in there, but also seeds and things of that nature. Well, right off the bat, one of the most important things in a pack house is being connected to water. We're hooked up to municipal water here. It's clean, it's safe, it's tested regularly by them. We can trust it as it's coming in through our pipes. That's really important for hand washing and for just making sure we've got good clean water when we're processing and cleaning our produce. For now, the hand washing sink is plumbed over there, but we'd like to actually move it over here right inside the door, because in our mindset, we want to go very linearly and very clearly from dirty to clean, and that begins by washing your hands before using your hands to handle the produce as it moves down the line. So we'd like to see that move over here. Using this kind of in the interim before it's finished, we don't have a lot of surfaces and a lot going on in here, but the surfaces we do have, we've selected to be very easy to clean and wipe down. That goes for, you know, the tables where we're setting things down, also our equipment for washing, for drying, and it even includes the walls. So in here, there's going to be lots of water, spray, most likely, things like that. We wanted to make every surface possible as easy to clean as possible. We're going to be putting in a different material up here on top. So this is fiber reinforced plastic, FRP. It's pretty expensive, so we're mainly just using it in the areas that are going to see lots of splashing. As I mentioned before, we're still in the middle of filling this out, finishing it up. But in the interim right now, we're using a 3-compartment sink to wash our greens. This obviously it's stainless steel, so again, very, very easy to clean. very easy to wipe down. Another really important surface is the floor. If this were gravel or anything else, you know, you can't really clean gravel that well. So having a slick, nice floor with these safety mats, it makes it very easy to, you know, squeegee stuff down the drains, keep this dry. The drains then empty into this sump pump down here, which we have the option of either sending it to a gray water catchment outside just for soaking back into the ground, or flipping to sewer. So primarily it's left on sewer, so we can be in code and things like that. Next up here are our totes. We use these ones specifically for produce. We don't use these out in the field to harvest. We use different bins for that. That way we make sure that there's not cross contact between clean produce and produce that's dirty. It might be leaving extra debris and stuff in the bins. They're all the standard size. It makes it really easy. You know, I can just guess looking at a bin like 5 pounds, boom, that's 5 pounds of greens. Easy for quick math, for judging kind of what you have in storage at any given time. Yeah, very few little nooks and crannies, very easy to keep clean. And then we keep them on these little carts so they're easy to move around as well. I would not say that that illustrated how easy it was to move. Okay, and now on to cold storage. This is a pretty simple structure. It's just framed out with 2x4s and some 2x6s. We have 2 layers of, I think it's R19 or something like that, insulated foam board. Not terribly expensive, 2 layers of that. And then, much like the rest of the pack house, we have this fiber reinforced panel, FRP, so that we can keep these walls very clean. It's easy to spot if something's on the wall. This is a converted AC unit. Well, the AC unit is not converted from anything, but there's this product called a CoolBot, which basically just convinces the AC unit to go much colder than it otherwise is programmed to go. So yeah, we keep between 38 and 34 in here at any given point, which is also very important for cold storage longevity and food safety.
Okay, and the other thing we want to think carefully about is cold storage. And I'll do my best to get this video to come up as well. But in talking with farmers early on in their planning, it's very important to consider cold storage, because cold storage allows you to take a crop which would have a very short shelf life and extend the shelf life of that crop to such a point that it expands the marketing opportunities for that crop. So let's see if we can get this video to come up here in just a moment.
So I'm Curtis Millsap of Millsap Farm. We've been farming for 13 years here just north of Springfield, Missouri. We do 2.5 acres of vegetables, and almost everything we grow goes through our cold storage system at some point or another. And that wasn't always the case. Years ago, when we just got started, we did not have any cold storage. When we bought the farm, there was really no storage infrastructure, but it was one of the first things we put in place. And the reason we did that was because we had been convinced by reading lots of farming books and visiting other farmers that unless you have cold storage, when you harvest vegetables, you're only about 12 hours away from having a giant compost heap. Cold storage is what makes the difference between being able to sell and harvest at your time frame versus the time frame that the temperature and climate allow for you. So on our farm, initially, we started with, I think it was a 9x11 cooler, which seemed huge when we built it. It was a monstrous room. And we used a CoolBot with one 220 air conditioner in there. I think it's a 22,000 BTU air conditioner, and that kept that room a very nice 35 degrees. We have since, over the years, expanded our cooler space twice. We first went in and just about doubled that 9x11. And then we kind of maximized that space. And then 3 years ago, we came in and rebuilt our coolers with this addition that you see behind me here, which is actually an 11x22 space that is split into 2 coolers. So we now have a warm room and 2 cold rooms. And by a warm room, I mean a 55-degree room. So why did we have done so much expansion? Well, the bottom line is, when we harvest radishes or head lettuce or squash, any of those relatively tender vegetables, especially the cold and crisp ones, if we can get them washed and into the cooler, then they can sit there for up to 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, it really depends on the crop, but if they've never been stressed and we get them cold quickly, they can sit there for 2 weeks and still be sold and be beautiful. Whereas we learned very early on, if you harvest a bunch of radishes and you don't have some way to get it cold very quickly, then within a few hours, everything's wilting, the radish itself is getting soft, and the tops, of course, are wilting as well. So getting things cold, keeping them cold, has really been key to our farm being able to grow beyond what we might be able to harvest in a couple hours and get to market with, and into the realm of things that it may take us all week to build up a big harvest, but then when we go to the farmer's market, we're selling $3,000 worth of produce instead of the maybe $800 that we might be able to harvest in a really short window and get to market with. So it really does make a huge difference, and it's not just for big scale. I mean, we had cold storage from very early on, and I think that any farm that's real serious about growing should consider cold storage one of the necessities of being a market grower.
Okay, so again, looking at my farm, you can see where the pack house was constructed. I also constructed a sizable parking area near the pack house. First of all, to handle my on-farm equipment, but also to give me a parking place for the sales area on the east side of the pack house. So part of infrastructure planning is thinking about parking too. And I've had farmers tell me that, well, parking is wasted space. Why do I need to have that much? Well, the bottom line is you want to think about efficient operations, and you want to think about keeping customers happy. And if you're bringing customers to the farm, an adequate parking area is critically important. So think carefully about where parking might be located. And frequently we can find areas on the farm where we couldn't use those areas for crop production for various reasons, but they might be well suited for parking or overflow parking. So again, important things to consider. Okay, any questions about pack houses?
We do not have any questions right now.
Okay, now let's turn our attention to production structures. And these are the buildings, the structures that we put up to make our production of crops more efficient and more productive. And as I mentioned with cold storage, and as I mentioned with a pack house, it's not long before especially crop farmers start thinking seriously about production structures, about ways to grow crops more effectively and more efficiently. Now, again, we've got another interview, which I will do my best. We'll try and see if it'll come up. I'm Patrick Byers, Field Specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and it's my pleasure today to be interviewing my friend Curtis Millsap. Curtis is a farmer north of Springfield at Millsap Farm, and I've invited him to join us to talk about the reasons that he is excited and interested in growing crops under protection. I've been out to your farm many times, and it's been very interesting to see the different types of protected covers that you use. And would you go ahead and just sort of compare and contrast the different types of structures and coverings that you use?
Yeah, so starting from a very base level, you can see in the foreground of this background picture here we've got that we use a lot of row covers. And sometimes we put those row covers on hoops, sometimes we put those row covers flat on top of the crops. But a basic floating row cover is, it's a permeable fabric, so the water and the air can pass through, but it gives a little bit of frost protection, gives a lot of wind protection. So that's kind of the first layer of protection on the farm, and a lot of times that's enough. In the case of something like a spinach crop or even sometimes even a kale crop, that may be enough to get it through the winter. Certainly in the spring, it's enough to get it a month of earliness out in the field for those frost-hardy crops. And then the next layer of protection for us would be some sort of simple plastic tunnel. And so we build a lot of these. We've got several, we call them kitten tunnels because they're kind of smaller than what we would call a caterpillar tunnel, but they're 15 feet wide, they're 7 feet tall. They're made out of a single piece. The hoop is made out of a single piece of 24-foot long chain link top rail, and it's a single layer of plastic. And rather than having a lot of structure to it, it's really a simple thing. It sits on stakes, it's got a single purlin down the middle, and the plastic is held on by sort of lacing back and forth with rope or old used drip line. And those structures are smaller than our bigger structures, and so they have less capacity to hold temperature, but they do a really fabulous job of growing head lettuce, spinach, kale, choy, all those kinds of frost hardy crops all through the winter. And we can get about a month or even a little more jump start in the spring on some of our warm weather crops as well in those tunnels. The other thing I really like about those tunnels is they're very easy to pull up stakes and move, literally pull the stakes up. We disassemble them, and I can, with one or two helpers, I can pull one of those down, move it to a new plot, and put it back up in a day. And so that's really nice in terms of soil health, the ability to rotate, because one of the issues we run into in covered space growing is soil quality and degradation. And then the next step up for me is what people would generally call a high tunnel. And so that's a pretty typical pipe structure. It's going to be a galvanized pipe. It's much heavier duty than the kitten tunnels are. So now the tunnels I've got, the high tunnels I've got are 2 3/8 inch pipe. I've got a 30-foot span and a 34-foot span, both of them 96 feet long. And those structures are great because we never worry about them in snow. They are really durable structures. They're big enough that they hold temperature better, so we get a little better frost protection in those. And they're a big open space to work in. We don't have them set up this way, but many of my friends have them set up in a way they can drive a tractor into them. And so that's handy too. When you get a big enough space like that, now you're able to work them, work the soil with a tractor if that's what you want to do. And then the final layer of protection on our farm, oh, and I should differentiate. So the high tunnels don't have any supplemental heat. And up till now, we have not talked about any sort of supplemental heat. The only thing I'll do in the high tunnels is in the early tomatoes, I will bring some of those propane torpedo heaters, so 1 heater per tunnel, and I'll run that just as a kind of insurance. So on a 28-degree night or something, I'll put row covers over the tomatoes, but I'll also bring a torpedo heater in there and I'll run that overnight. It'll cost me about $15 in propane to run one of those overnight, and it'll protect us from frost down to about 23 is as low as I've seen that go, and have that propane heater work. Pretty simple, easy, low-cost protection, but it's nothing permanent. And then we go into our biggest structure, and that is a greenhouse. And it's built in the concrete foundation. It actually has sidewalks, things like that. My predecessor used it to grow nursery crops. We grow primarily plants, primarily food, but of course we also grow all of our seedlings in there as well. And it has a propane furnace and a wood furnace. It has permanent hydrants and hoses everywhere. It's a very utilitarian growing structure, but also has some of the bells and whistles that make it more comfortable to work with, and a certain level of automation. So it's got thermostats and fans, things like that. So it's kind of, as you look at the spectrum, it goes from that simple row cover laid on top of plants all the way up to this 2-layer plastic on top of serious metal structure that has electricity and furnaces and things like that. So we really have a full spectrum of options, and all of them have their place. There's certainly an increasing price spectrum. So as somebody gets started, as I got started, certainly the low-cost options were the ones that made sense. But as we've been able to upgrade, some of the nice things about like a high tunnel is it's a little bit easier to work with. It costs a little more, but it requires a little less of the grower in terms of daily work. So in some ways, what I see the differential as you work your way up the scale is the higher you get up the cost and sort of, we'll say, utility scale. So the more useful and the more it heats and takes care of the plants, the less it requires of the grower to put in grunt work each day, and vice versa. So you can kind of trade money for labor in a sense. So that's one way to think of how the tunnels work. And then the other way to think of it is, at the low end of the spectrum, you're doing minimal protection, and so you're going to expect minimal increase for that. And then when you get into an actual greenhouse where you can control nighttime temperatures to a high degree, we can keep a 50-degree nighttime temperature in our greenhouse through the winter if we want to, with those wood furnaces and the propane furnace. Now we're talking about a structure that can do a tremendous amount in terms of production that those high tunnels and ground covers really can't. So there's a trade-off there. And I think everybody has to kind of find their sweet spot within that spectrum. But that's what we do.
I'm Patrick Byers, Field Specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and I want to thank Curtis Millsap for joining me today to talk about his experiences with protected culture. So when we think about protective growing structures, they range all the way from greenhouses, where we very carefully control the environment through things such as heating systems, cooling systems, and humidity management systems, through high tunnels, which give us many of the benefits of greenhouse, but without some of the precise environmental controls, to caterpillar tunnels, which are a bit like high tunnels, but they're temporary structures, to low tunnels, which are smaller, which typically protect just a bed or even a single row of crop, to row covers, which rest on top of the crop. So again, you can see a sort of an increasing level of sophistication and expense and control as we move from row covers through low tunnels to caterpillar tunnels to high tunnels to greenhouses. All of these are structures that farmers might consider. So what is a greenhouse? Well, it's a durable, complex structure. Typically, it's covered with 1 to 2 layers of plastic, or sometimes even more durable coverings, such as rigid plastic, glass, or other substances. In a greenhouse, we're able to control the environment to a precise degree. And oftentimes these controls are automated so that we can preset temperatures on thermostats, and we can control very, very carefully, again, to a precise degree, the level of temperature, the level of humidity, and the amount of light that crops receive. Typically, a greenhouse is a permanent structure. It's attached to a foundation. Frequently, it has a hard surfaced floor. And in many cases, in greenhouses, crops are grown on some sort of elevated structure, a bench, a table, a tower, something like that. And in many greenhouses, we can grow crops year-round, 4-season production, because again, we can provide heat during the cold part of the growing season, and we can cool the area during the hot part of the growing season. What is a high tunnel? Well, sometimes it's called a hoop house. It's a simple, durable structure. It's covered with 1 to 2 layers of plastic. Typically, it's unheated. If it is heated, it's oftentimes heated with a temporary heating system. We rely upon passive solar heat to keep the tunnel warm. It's typically manually ventilated by end vents and by movable side curtains that open and close in response to the interior temperature. We can automate to some degree environmental control in the high tunnel. High tunnels are considered to be temporary permanent structures. Permanent, yes, in that the structure is more or less permanent, but temporary in that they can be moved or even relocated. And in a high tunnel, we can have 4-season production, but typically we have to grow cool season crops during the cool part of the year and warm season crops during the warm part of the year, because we don't have as strong a control of temperature in a high tunnel as we would in a greenhouse. What is a caterpillar tunnel? Caterpillar tunnel is a simple structure. It's covered with 1 layer of plastic. Typically, caterpillar tunnels are unheated, passive solar type structures. They frequently have less beefy structure than a high tunnel. They're not intended to be in place during periods of time where there might be heavy ice or snow accumulation. And as we look at this tunnel, we can see that, yes, it's a temporary structure. It's less strong, say, than a high tunnel would be, but still a valuable tunnel for crop production. What is a low tunnel? Well, a low tunnel is a simple structure as well. It's covered with 1 layer of plastic or a row cover. And frequently, and in fact, in most cases, low tunnels are unheated. The only heat gain that we see in a low tunnel is passive solar heat. They're manually ventilated by opening up the ends of the low tunnel and by lifting the sides. Definitely a temporary structure. In fact, low tunnels have difficulty standing up to high winds. Certainly, they would not stand up to ice or snow. Another structure to consider would be a seedling and transplant facility, someplace to grow transplants. Now, why do we need a separate structure for seedling and transplant production? Well, in this structure, we're growing those transplants that will then be placed in a high tunnel or in a field bed to develop the actual cropping area. And recognize that by doing this, we're taking seed and we're growing a seedling or a transplant that is ready for this particular move. And initially, seeds are expensive. We want to have an area where we can control the environment to encourage good germination of those seeds and good growth of the resulting seedlings. Quality in seedlings and transplants equals good performance. And growing quality seedlings and transplants requires control of the environment. We also like to use transplants because we get complete stands. when we transplant them out into a high tunnel, a greenhouse, or an open field. And this, of course, maximizes production and our yields. And again, timing is important too. If we have a transplant structure, we can actually time things more carefully because we can control the environment more carefully. And especially if we're trying to make the most out of rotations or successions in a high tunnel, in a greenhouse, or in the open field, we need to have those transplants at the right time. And the way that we develop a system to have transplants at the right time is being able to control the environment where we're growing those transplants. So here is an example of a seedling and transplant production facility. And basically, these are areas where we can carefully control temperature, moisture, and lighting, and provide these in an optimum situation for the growth of transplants. And temperature control, of course, is achieved by the environment around the seedlings, but we can also provide bottom heat using heating mats or recirculated tubing systems underneath the flats. As we look at this picture, we see those black plastic flats where we're growing seedlings, and underneath it, if you look carefully, you can see a system of tubes that contain hot water. And that hot water then warms the growing environment for the seeds and then the resulting seedlings. We can also develop automated watering so that we can very carefully make sure that these young plants, which are very sensitive to drying out, don't dry out. So we can have automated watering. And we can also provide systems that correct humidity so that we encourage good growth of quality transplants. Now, again, think carefully about where you're going to locate your protective structures. There are some basic rules relative to east, west, north, south. Here in southwest Missouri, we can orient these structures either direction and obtain good exposure to sunlight. But some other things to think about, first of all, the availability of water. In the environment of a greenhouse, a tunnel, low tunnel, even a caterpillar tunnel, even a low tunnel, that environment is such that we as farmers have to provide water because obviously the tunnel excludes water. And so water availability is very important. Power availability is helpful, especially if we plan to automate some aspect of managing the greenhouse, the high tunnel, or the other structures. Surrounding land uses obviously play a role. And efficiency is important here too. These are structures that have to be managed and maintained. And locating them in such a way that these operations are efficient is very helpful. If you have a tunnel that's several hundred yards away from other parts of the farm, it becomes an inefficient process to hike out to that tunnel to open and close the sidewalls. On the other hand, if you've located the tunnel closer in the overall organization of your infrastructure, it makes management of things such as raising and lowering the sidewalls more efficient. Now, looking at my farm, I put up a seedling house. You can see its small structure there close to the existing house. I know that management in the seedling house requires a lot of attention, so I wanted that close to my home. I put up a tunnel that's out in the berry area, and I'll be the first to say this is not a particularly efficient location because it is a bit of a walk out to that tunnel. But this was the best area that I had to locate that particular structure. It's close to my water line. It's also close to an electric line, and I placed wiring in the same trench when I placed the water lines, so that I have wiring power available down that water line to my control points and also to the high tunnel. So again, think about where you're going to place your utilities relative to structures such as high tunnels. Okay, do we have any questions at this point, Anna, relative to structures for production?
We do not.
Okay, very good. All right, now let's talk a bit about storage, because sooner or later we're going to have areas to store our equipment, perhaps, to store packaging, to store building materials, to store other things that we need to keep out of the weather. So we want to think carefully about where we're going to locate that storage, again, from the standpoint of efficiency. So again, what are we going to need to store? Machinery and equipment, pesticides. If we're using pesticides, we have to have separate storage that is secure and climate controlled, storage areas for supplies, and recognize that sometimes these areas need to be discrete. We certainly would not want to store supplies or packaging adjacent to pesticides or fertilizers. So we want to think about how we're going to store these various things that we're using on the farm. Our crop management tools and harvest containers, those should be stored in areas that we can protect them from contamination from things such as rodents. Packaging for crop storage, again, store these in areas where once they've been cleaned and sanitized, they can be kept clean and sanitized. And then packaging for crop sales. For example, if we're purchasing plastic clamshells or other packaging for sales, we need to have storage areas for those where we can keep these pieces of material, this packaging, clean. And again, looking at my farm, you can see the structure that I showed you earlier is now my storage structure. And in this particular structure, I keep equipment. I also keep pesticides and supplies in separate enclosed areas within that storage building. And you might remember from my diagram of the pack house, my packaging for sales is stored in the pack house. Okay, some farms realize opportunities related to value added and processing. And if this is somewhere in the plan for your farm, you want to think carefully about what those facilities are going to look like. Now, some farms will go to the expense of developing areas that can be inspected and certified by local health departments, and particularly with certain products such as acidified products or other high-risk products. These have to be prepared in certified kitchens or certified production areas. In other cases, such as jellies and jams, honey, baked goods, these can actually be prepared in non-inspected areas in Missouri. Missouri has in place cottage laws that allow for this, but even in that setting, it's important to have areas that are designated for production of value-added products that can be kept clean and sanitized so that the products are produced in such a way that they're safe for consumers. So again, some basic considerations related to value-added and processing facilities need to be in place. And it's an excellent practice to consult with your local county health department personnel before moving very far down the line of planning facilities for value-added and processing. These staff people can be very helpful from the standpoint of understanding the requirements to produce safe value-added and processed products. Now, if your goal is minimal processing, let's say just freezing excess production or perhaps drying in the original form, for example, freezing blueberries or say drying mushrooms, then oftentimes the facility does not have to be very extensive. And in fact, the regulation of frozen products is not nearly as intense as it would be for products that are handled more during processing. Remember the cottage law products that I just mentioned? There are low-risk products and there are high-risk products, and the intensity of the process oftentimes plays a role here. And particularly with high-risk products where there is, again, a significant risk relative to potential contamination or other issues with the processed product, these have to be produced in facilities that have been inspected. Now, we have another interview here that I'll see if I can bring the video up. So let me go ahead and stop sharing here for a moment, see if we can bring this up.
Well, we're now in the processing facility here at Three Oaks Farm, and this is a facility that has been inspected by the Howell County Health Department. It's passed inspection. It is a certified kitchen. And you don't have to spend millions of dollars on a facility to have it be in compliance with your local health department. So I'm excited. Patrice is going to show us through the facility and talk about the different areas that are important from the standpoint of producing safe products. So Patrice?
Okay, one of the things that you have to have is a hand washing sink. And I paid $1 for this at an Amish auction. You just collect wherever you can. Mm-hmm. Got to have an antibacterial hand washing soap and the paper towels, and that's about it for here. We've got 2 refrigerators, freezers. Inside is a thermometer in each one, because the health inspector will check for that. Let's see. Okay, we've got the 3 sink. The guys are working, so it's a little working. But we've got the 3 sinks that you have to have, a rinse, a wash, and a sanitizer, and the draining. Everything has to be washable. Craig found that this is shower board, and it was cheaper than buying dairy board. So everything has to be washable.
And obviously the stainless steel is the
stainless
perfect
steel.
material to have the sink made for.
Again, we paid $80 from an auction guy that had just come back from an auction and wanted to get rid of it. So you just start collecting. If you're going to get a commercial kitchen, just start collecting, and you'll see how fast you can pull that together. The countertops we got on the cheap from, I believe it was Home Depot. And the floor, again, they're working, so it's a little messy, but it's washable. It's the garage paint. We have the fan, the exhaust that you've got to have in here. Everything has to be upside down like these buckets. And all of the working, the pans, when they're done washing them, they'll all be upside down if they don't have a lid on it for rodent control.
Now I see a heavy use of stainless steel in the
Yes.
various cooking pots and strainers and various other things you're using. And obviously that's a material that's easy to clean and sanitize.
It is, very much so. And if you notice, the boys have their hats on. If you don't have an original container, like our pectin, we buy 50-pound bags. You've got to have the name and the date that you put that in there. Everything has to be at least 6 inches off the ground. So Craig built these shelves, and it's more than 6 inches, and it works great.
So tell me about the bottles.
The bottles, we get these from Arkansas Glass Company, and they're hot. He puts them in the oven up to 200 degrees, and they're hot before he pours the, I guess he's still making raspberry syrup. Yes. Raspberry syrup.
Very good.
And we have another, on the other side of that door, we have another packing shed where we have a big stock of the jars so that we don't run out.
Okay, anything else that you want to point out? What about the light fixtures?
The light fixtures, thank you. They have to be covered from the light that's inside, so that if the light breaks, there's no glass that can fall in to anything. It's actually, once you start collecting the materials, you can pull this together. For us, it was kind of simple because this was used to be a house, so the plumbing and the electricity was here. That was an advantage that we did have. What else am I missing?
Well, I think you've done a pretty nice job of describing the facility and how you don't have to spend millions of dollars.
No.
It is important to keep the health department regulations in mind as you design a processing facility, but you can do it for a reasonable cost.
You can do it, yes.
Very good.
Yes, just start collecting.
Well, thank you, Patrice.
One of the things about a deep 3 sink that I've seen in other facilities, and I don't know if it's just Howell County, if the other health departments would let you know, that would save a lot of money and expenses for somebody, is I've seen them use the three utility sinks side by side that you can pick up at Home Depot.
Okay.
And that would save somebody a lot of money if they were allowed to use that.
Okay.
So any questions on value added?
Excuse me, not right now.
Okay, very good. All right, let's talk a bit about sales. And frequently, farmers consider on-farm sales early on in their planning process. It's just very efficient to sell product on the farm. You don't have to move product off farm. You don't have to dedicate personnel to sales when you move that product off farm. So sales areas on farm can be definitely an advantage, but it's very important to plan those carefully. Now, I touched on earlier during the discussion of land and land position, having sufficient local population to support local sales on farm. But assuming that's there, now let's turn our attention to developing sales areas. So if we're interested in a farm stand, we're going to need a display and sales area. Okay, obviously an area to attractively display our product and to market it. We're going to need bathroom and hand washing facilities. Anytime we welcome people to the farm, we need to have facilities for hand washing and for bathroom use. Electricity, of course, is very important. In most cases, our farm stands have electricity available, but if we're interested in pick your own, where people are actually going out to the production field to harvest crop, it can be efficient to locate the sales checkout area close to those fields, and those may not be particularly conveniently located relative to your utilities. Well, in this case, perhaps we can use battery-powered equipment, battery-powered cash registers, and those sorts of things, or maybe we can run temporary lines out to those areas. But it's still important to think about electricity wherever we can on the farm. Supplemental lighting is very helpful. We may be keeping sales areas open into the evening or even at night. So we want to think about supplemental lighting to support these activities. Protection from the elements. These open air sales areas are very attractive, but what happens when we have rain, particularly if it's wind-driven rain? And then we want to think about crop storage because, as I mentioned before, having storage areas, cold storage in particular, can expand the market window for produce items. And especially for selling them on farm, it's very convenient to move crop from a cold storage area that's adjacent to the actual sales area. So we should take advantage of that flexibility. Okay, so now the whole farm plan, we introduced this initially. Now we'll just briefly use this to close out the workshop this evening. You want to consider the present, certainly, but you also want to think about the future. And I touched on this in the discussion of things such as the water distribution system and parking areas and the availability of utilities, all those things. We want to think about the present, but also the future. We always want to think about efficiency. There are only so many hours in the day, and we have jobs to get done as farmers. And if we can design our infrastructure in such a way that operations are efficient, this allows us to get more value out of those hours. And we always want to think about maintenance, and we want to think about expansion, because it's not unusual for a farm to see opportunity and to expand. And if we've planned infrastructure right from the beginning, this expansion becomes just a natural part of our farm's trajectory, not a complete disruption and reorganization. So again, before we leave my farm, I wanted to show you how things developed. You can see the infrastructure, my production areas, the berry production area, the garlic production area, and the persimmon production area, my seedling house, my storage area, my pack house. Again, all of these things carefully considered, carefully planned, and developed in such a way that the whole is an efficient use of my time and my energies and my resources. Here's what it looks like if you take an aerial view. And again, you can see those buildings that I mentioned, the pack house there at the upper right, the storage building, the high tunnel as we move towards the west. And then you can see the production areas for the berries there. You can see production areas for garlic. And I'm just starting to develop the area for the persimmons there between the house and the barn. Okay, well, that is a discussion of farm infrastructure. Obviously, we could have taken any of those subjects and gone much, much deeper into the planning process and the implementation process. But I hope that the material we covered was useful and started a thought process for you. And as I mentioned before, please feel free to reach out at any time if you'd like another set of eyes to look at a project or another set of ears to listen to your plans. I'd love to work with you in developing the infrastructure of your specialty crop farms. So Anna, with that, let me go ahead and discontinue sharing. Okay, do we have any questions at this point?
We do not. Patrick, thank you so much for being with us tonight and presenting. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.